and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, bi-weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian. First up this week. We don't need this, 25th of February 2015. How dare Road Safety Minister Lisa Harvey say we need 3 times as many speed cameras to bring us in line with New South Wales and Victoria. More speed cameras in bid to cut road toll. News 21st of the 2nd. She forgot to mention the population in Victoria is double, and in New South Wales triple, that of our WA population. Cameras do not fix bad driving. They are, however, a proven cash generator for lazy government and ignore the very poor level of real police presence on our roads. Please do not insult us with flawed reasoning and dodgy comparisons to other states. David Finney, Canning Vale. So recently, the government here has announced that they're going to increase the number of speed cameras we have here in WA. They're roughly going to triple it over the next several years, and it will bring us in line much more with what New South Wales and Victoria are doing in terms of the number of speed cameras they're using. New South Wales and Victoria have the lowest level of traffic fatalities in Australia. WA usually sits somewhere around the middle. Historically, we've had one of the worst. Reasons for this vary, but the basic point is that the more rural a state is, the more of their population who travel long distances on country roads, the higher the road toll is. WA is very highly urbanised. We're the most urbanised state in Australia, with 80% of our population living basically in metropolitan Perth, and 20% living in the vast state that's, the size of Western Europe. That said, even though it's an 80-20 split, the number of fatalities on the road is roughly 50-50. So about half of our deaths from traffic accidents occur in metropolitan Perth, and about half in country areas, which means that country people have about 4 times the risk of dying in a car accident than metropolitan Perth. As a result of this, if you look at other states, so the worst performing states generally are Northern Territory, Queensland, then things like South Australia and Tasmania. They also have larger country areas. New South Wales and Victoria have large city populations and relatively small amount of country areas. So that is one of the reasons why they have relatively low road tolls. But aside from that, Victoria and New South Wales have ploughed a lot of money and effort into reducing their road toll over the last 10 or 15 years or so, and a lot of this has revolved around speed camera usage. The statistics on this are actually very clear. One, they do actually work. Even fixed cameras with known locations actually do reduce traffic accidents if they are in dangerous locations. And by and large, intersections are one of the main risks for metropolitan areas. So putting fixed cameras on intersections actually does work to reduce the number of road accidents, including deaths. Beyond fixed cameras, mobile cameras actually are even more effective. So cameras that are placed at a different location from day to day. And New South Wales actually trialled not using them and had a significant spike in deaths on the road in that year and have subsequently brought them back. In terms of revenue raising, yes, there is a certain amount of revenue that is raised by speed cameras. The statistics across Australia have consistently shown that the cost to government from treating the trauma from road accidents, if we look at policing, law enforcement, or mainly for medical costs for treating people who've been injured in car accidents, that is disproportionately much higher than the revenue raised by speed cameras. And so even here, where our road toll is not that bad, there's only about 150 people odd die a year on Western Australian roads. The cost of that and the cost of all the non-fatal accidents far outweighs any revenue that's brought in. But the other thing is that here in WA particularly, because of the contentiousness politically of having revenue raised by speed cameras, here all of that money is actually quarantined and goes into the Road Safety Authority or something like that. So there's an independent, basically, body that receives all money that comes from speed cameras and is spent entirely on improving road safety through education campaigns, improving roads, fixing them up, making them safer, things like that. So actually here, there is no general revenue for the government that is raised by speed cameras. If speed cameras, catch more people and the more money is raised, that money goes straight into road safety campaigns. And so it is hardly a proven cash generator for the West Australian government. What the government wants to do is actually to, in essence, save money by having less accidents. And it is a simple cost-benefit analysis shows that actually having more speed cameras reduces accidents, and it is a reasonable expenditure that you get back more than what you put in. The interesting thing here in WA is I suspect that we do, if we triple our speed cameras, which they're planning on, we will have equivalent numbers of speed cameras to those other more popular states, which makes it sound like we've got too many. But I think the thing about here is because we are sparsely populated outside of the metropolitan area, I suspect we have a large number of speed cameras in non-metropolitan areas that get underutilised compared to, say, Victoria and New South Wales. So what's happening here is each relatively small town needs to have a speed camera, but only has a certain number of police officers, say, to operate it, and so much of the time it's not being used. If you look at the number of hours of speed camera usage, I think you'll find that in WA, our hours of usage is actually quite low, and that's what we need to improve. Now, in recent days, an academic who specialises in road safety has come out and basically said that the fixed cameras are not anywhere near as effective as the mobile cameras. And so the state government's plan to increase fixed cameras particularly rather than mobile cameras is not a particularly good plan. I mean, it's still going to reduce road deaths, but not as much as if we were to increase mobile cameras. And I think that's broadly speaking true. But this idea that, particularly here in WA, but also across the board, this idea that speed cameras are for revenue raising and that they don't actually change people's driving behaviours is flat out false. The evidence completely contradicts that and shows that actually they are effective, which is why we keep using them. And they don't particularly raise revenue. I've read a few independent evaluations of them, and time and time again it's found that the money that's raised in fines is very low compared to the cost of treating road accident victims. So there you go. Speed cameras. You might not like them, but they're actually a good idea. Behind Closed Doors, 27th of February 2015. In reply to Ron Elliott, Loving in Winter, letters 26th of the 2nd, old people being intimate is like a pie-eating contest. Fun for participants, but not pleasant to watch. Reese Winterburn, City Beach. So this is probably said tongue-in-cheek, but this is in regards to, there was a whole string of letters back and forth about the idea that older people, senior citizens in particular, and retirees, showing intimacy in public, kissing and holding and hugging and things like that, is somehow unseemly or is not, is disgusting might be a slightly stronger word, but basically like along those lines. And I just want to point out, this is one of those kind of, bigotry might be a strong word for it, but society's general disgust with the idea that older people, one, can be affectionate to each other, or two, can be sexually active, is one of those things that I think it is a sort of a low-level bigotry against older people that is socially acceptable. That this idea that when you pass a certain age, nobody else will, outside of your age group, would possibly find you attractive, and people within your age group probably shouldn't find you attractive, and therefore if you're engaged in any kind of sort of activity like that, that this is somehow unseemly and we shouldn't have to put up with it. The problem with this, and I don't have a particular fetish for older people, I'm not particularly interested in looking at it myself, and I do in fact have a slight disgust reaction to it. But then I also have a slight disgust reaction to homosexuality. And I know that that is just irrational and is hardly a good indicator of what should or should not be accepted in society. And so just because I personally don't find homosexuality to be a particularly attractive thing, shouldn't be the basis on which we as a society deem something acceptable in public. I'm not going to turn that into an argument to say that I shouldn't have to see gay people kissing in public. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. That's completely, not completely, bigoted, and it is discriminatory. But I think the same argument applies for older people. Just because I personally don't enjoy seeing older people making out in a particularly sort of passionate manner doesn't mean that they should therefore be banned from doing it in public any more than young, attractive people doing so. Other people's right to, be... And I'm not talking about full-blown sex and nudity in public, but other people's right to sort of behave in a manner that is, amorous, shouldn't be governed by whether or not onlookers find that an attractive sight. Onlookers should be basically irrelevant to the discussion, as long as what you're doing is not grossly inappropriate. And I think it is only bigotry that would suggest that older people kissing in public is somehow grossly inappropriate. Next up, give due credit, 28th of February 2015. Due to circumstances beyond her control, our adult daughter has been an inpatient of Fiona Stanley Rehabilitation Centre for the past 7 weeks. During this time, she has been patiently assisted by so many caring and compassionate Serco employees. Please don't denigrate Serco as a whole. There are many in this group who wave their special wand to brighten the lives of Fiona Stanley Hospital patients. Jenny Richter, Redcliffe. So, there's quite a bit of backstory to this. Serco is a British company, which is now a multinational company that runs governments contracts for governments doing services. So they run hospitals and prisons and call centres and all these kind of things across the world as sort of they're a private contractor to governments for these kind of things, and they're a large organisation that lobbed into Perth and Australia generally in a big way about sort of 10 odd years ago now. So before that, WA basically hadn't privatised anything, really. All of its prisons were publicly operated and run. All of its hospitals were publicly operated and run. Even the lesser things like catering for the armed services, these kind of things that tend to get privatised these days. WA hadn't done any of that. We hadn't privatised all of our energy production, so all of our power plants, all of our water supply, all of this was all in government hands and had been forever. We were quite slow to the privatisation game. About 15 odd years ago now, they started to privatise some of these things. So particularly there was a new prison being built that the government decided would be privately operated, and that they would also privatise the transport of prisoners, basically transporting prisoners between court and prisons and between prisons, that kind of thing. And around the same time, they also looked to build new minor hospitals in a metropolitan area that would then be operated by private organisations. So we had a couple of private hospitals. So I guess we did have some private hospitals, but not privatised hospitals. So though we had private hospitals which were purely for profit, run by private organisations, and we had public hospitals which was part of our public hospital system. So your entitlement to essentially free medical care was only ever in the public system. About 10-15 years ago, they looked at building new public hospitals that would be then run by private contractors. And so they started doing all of this. Now, Serco came in a little bit later after that, about 10 years ago, and took over they took over a prison and they took over the court transport. Subsequently, they've also taken over the running of immigration detention centres and a variety of other contracts across Australia. There have, of course, been a number of problems with privatisation in general, and because Serco has been one of the main companies running private contracts here, they have basically been the focus of a lot of that. They've had a lot of the issues, and they've become the focus of a lot of the gripes about privatisation. And as a result, there is this big thing that Serco is basically a for-profit company that is not particularly interested in things like patient care. Serco is now running the brand spanking new major hospital that we have just opened, Fiona Stanley Hospital, here in the metropolitan area. It's the big public hospital of the state, and Serco is running it. And of course, there's been a lot of issues with it since its opening. So there's been minor teething problems, we would say. Nothing huge at this point, but small things. And every time there's a small thing, it's always like, it must be Serco's fault. Even though they weren't actually, I don't think they were actually involved in the design and construction of the hospital. I think that was actually done by other companies. Beside the point. So there's been a lot of stuff in the paper about Serco and how terrible it is because it's a private company and it's not interested in patients, it's not interested in public safety, it's just interested in turning a buck. And so this letter came in to basically argue that, no, hey, let's not denigrate Serco as a whole. Serco, the people who work for Serco are actually good people. And on that point, I would basically agree that as an ex-Serco employee myself, I worked for them for a few years, I quite happily agree that lots of people who work for Serco are good people. But the other thing I would argue is that a bad system will break a good person every time. That good people just simply can't last in bad systems. the bad system will grind the good out of everybody, and you will end up with good people doing bad things, or the good people will leave, making room for the bad people. This is certainly my experience working for Serco, and I've worked for other private contractors as well. It's not just Serco, and that was certainly my experience for them as well. Even in government, we see the same thing, that even a publicly run institution, if it is a badly run institution, the bad system will break the good people. The only way to maintain a good system is to have good people in it, maintaining the good system. Once it goes bad, if you are one of the few people who believe in truth and justice and all of the rest of it in a system, there's very little you can do. And so all of those good Serco employees working in this hospital, more props to them. They're doing a great job, and that's fine. And I think that's excellent, and we should encourage it. But any private organisation has a lot of shareholder pressure on it to make as much money as possible out of the contract. Serco were actually one of the better organisations I worked for, in terms of they had, at least at the time, a longer term view of contracts, which meant that there was wisdom in the organisation that said, if we screw every dollar out of this contract, that will make us unlikely to get the next contract and the next contract, and that's bad business overall. But that kind of reasoning only lasts so long in any private company that has to pay dividends to shareholders every quarter. I'm firmly a believer that I'm not convinced that privatisation can work long term. I know there's a lot of people that argue around that, but I've seen very well-written contracts that screw down every single requirement on the contractor, and in the end, if the company isn't able to make good money out of it, they'll simply get out of the contract. I don't see this as being the solution. I don't think the solution to poorly run government facilities is to then encourage private companies to run them, because I can't see private companies having a long-term interest in good governance. Willing to be proven wrong. But yeah, so Serco, people who work for Serco, obviously there are a lot of good people who work for Serco, just like there is in every organisation. But a bad system that places pressure on its people to cut corners, or who simply reduce staff numbers down to the bare minimum so as to make as much money as possible, given that staffing costs is one of the biggest costs here in WA, it doesn't matter how good you are as a person, if there aren't enough of you there, you simply can't do good work. And inevitably that seems to be the way that privatisation seems to happen, at least here in WA. Maybe experiences elsewhere are different, although all I ever seem to hear is horror stories from overseas. Anyway, last up for this week. Hold telcos liable, 3rd of March 2015. Banning all use of mobile phones by drivers in vehicles is necessary to reduce the number of accidents and injuries to other road users. WA's compulsory third-party insurance scheme cannot afford to compensate all injured people fairly. Therefore, injured drivers and passengers are forced to use the Medicare system for payment of medical costs and continuing treatment, and dig into their resources for lawyers. Too many drivers are using mobile phones and texting, not looking and not concentrating. Mobile phones have been banned in other countries. Telstra and other telcos should be held responsible for injuries caused by drivers on phones. M. Walters, Mount Pleasant. So, the older generation, who happen to be the ones writing into these letters to the editor, it seems, perennially take issue with mobile phone use while driving. And I'm not one to defend it. It obviously is a very dangerous practice. But it's not like it's allowed here. I mean, all handheld use of mobile phones has been banned for the last several years. Currently, it is allowed that you can use a hands-free set. And I would perhaps support banning that altogether. I am aware that there is some evidence that hands-free kits for car, using a hands-free kit while driving, is actually more distracting than having a conversation with a passenger. There's some suggestions about why that would be, and the passenger is also aware generally of road conditions, and so can adjust their conversation to your needs as a driver, and also that you are better able to hear a passenger, that mobile phone quality voice is worse, and therefore your brain has to work harder to understand what the other person's saying, and that is more distracting. Whatever it is, there's some research. It's not terribly great, but it is, good enough that I would suggest I'd happily get rid of hands-free communication while driving. I'm not sure what the implications for business would be, and I suspect that there might be a fair bit of effect of that, and I would have to look at that first. But broadly speaking, usage of mobile phones while driving is not allowed here in WA, and it's not like... The thing about this letter that I find absolutely ridiculous is this idea that the telcos, like Telstra and the other mobile phone companies, are somehow responsible for it, or could somehow do something about it. Now, I've got a hands-free kit in my car, and it's fully integrated with the sound system. So, if there was a ban on mobile phone use, all mobile phone use while driving, I have no idea how they could possibly enforce that, because I'm not holding my phone. I don't have an earpiece in, I don't have a microphone. All I would be doing was speaking. And to any police officer driving past, it's no more obvious that I am, singing along with the music than I am speaking on the phone. The idea that telcos could somehow do something about that, the best they could hope to do would be to track the usage. They could probably have algorithms that could detect when people are on the phone while in moving vehicles. There's no way that I can think of for them to distinguish between drivers who are talking on the phone and passengers or people on buses or trains. As far as I can tell, I can't think of a single possible way that telcos could possibly do anything about drivers using the phone. And I'm not sure that there's been some recent moves by the police to use non-marked motorcycle riders, police on motorcycles, but unmarked motorcycles with helmet cameras, whereby they cruise this roads, and when they find somebody who's talking on the phone or texting, my God, how dangerous is that? But anyway, they can then record them using their helmet camera, and then they radio to another police car who's nearby, that then pulls them over and fines them or whatever. And this has been actually quite successful in catching people. Whether it's successful in reducing the actual overall usage, I don't know. But anyway, I like this letter purely because it seems to be suggesting that the phone companies are somehow in a position to, one, be responsible for what people do while driving, and two, in a position to do something about it. That seems to be the quality of thought in letter writers to the Western Australian. Anyway, that's it for this week. I hope you're all doing well, and join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.